Welcome to the final module of the Adolescent Literacy Virtual Foundations Training. You've worked your way through content literacy overview, writing to learn, academic dialogue, and vocabulary development. Now we think about planning and how does all this that we've been learning translate into classroom practice. So if you go to your website, you'll see that the planning tab is out here on the end. If you scroll down, you'll see a quick write. And then you'll see 3 documents that we're going to use as part of this video. The first document is a double entry organizer. Double entry organizer is one of those reading comprehension note-taking strategies that helps the participants connect whatever the new information is, in this case, this video, with their experience and their thinking. As you are watching the video and you're capturing your thinking in your double entry organizer, think about connections that this will make for you and your content and processes you use in your classroom. Think about the help you're going to need in planning and thinking about how to support students in being successful with these strategies, and what questions you have for the facilitators and for the CTL staff that will be supporting you as the year goes on. We really look forward to thinking about how we really embrace literacy across the curriculum in our buildings. And I think this is going to be an interesting opportunity for you. You'll notice we've given you some prompts so you can capture the key details, but you can also capture information that helps you answer the prompts. The second document we're going to be using is a description of the minimum daily learning sequence framework that we use at CTL. This has some major themes. It also has some components, and we'll walk through that. The third document is that framework applied to the modules that you've experienced as part of this training. So we'll walk through the content literacy overview module just to give you a sense of how we think about some of these key components. All right, so let's get started. So you might want to have your DEO, your double entry organizer, open a split screen or a printed, whatever works for you. You might just want to watch the video and come back. But we are going to use something called the power of pause, and that is anytime you feel like you want to capture something, go ahead and pause the video. And if you don't, I will give you a couple opportunities to pause the video to come back in and check on your double entry organizer. The minimum daily learning sequence framework really came about because we know there are components that we want teachers to think about as they're planning lessons. And before we think about the actual lesson itself, these things need to happen in advance. And that is the idea of thinking about creating a coherent experience. For the purposes of this training, we're using the definition of united as or forming a whole as our meaning for coherence. And that is that we're creating instruction that supports the student in learning the content, not just from a content perspective, but also from a strategy and process perspective. We want to make sure they have the skills necessary to be successful to grapple with the content they're learning. Those two things are going to work together. The second theme that we want to think about as we're planning is purposeful literacy. We don't do literacy just to be doing literacy. We want to make sure that the strategies we use and the processes we use help us achieve our learning goals, our learning objectives. We'll get to that in just a second. So we don't say, we're going to use the interactive word wall. We say, I really want to make sure that my students have the opportunity to make connections between all this vocabulary we're using. What's a strategy that helps us do that? Well, interactive word wall can do that. Do the students have everything they need to be successful with that strategy? Another part of the purposeful literacy is this idea of literacy and balance. Different kinds of literacy, writing versus speaking versus reading, use different parts of the brain. So we want to make sure that we're being a balanced approach to that literacy, so we're using the whole brain. If we don't allow students to talk about what they're learning with their peers, then different parts of the brain are not used, and they're not making as strong of connections, they're not accessing their prior knowledge as well, and they're not organizing their thinking as well. So to really have deep, lasting thinking, we want to make sure we have that balanced approach to literacy. And then the last piece of purposeful literacy that we want to think about is how do we make sure that students have strong enough understanding of the strategy or process we're using. At CTL, we use this gradual release model where it's I do, you watch. I'm going to do a think aloud, letting you know about what I'm thinking as I'm going through this process. And then as we progress, we do the I do, you help. Got a little experience, but I don't expect you to have full control of the strategy or process. So I'll want you to give me some information. What do you think I'm going to do next? Why am I going to do it? Then we progress to you do, I help. Now you've got a little bit more experience, and I want you to take control, but I recognize you don't have full control of all the nuances. So I'm going to give you some hints. I'm going to give you some help. I'm going to ask you some questions to make sure that we're using those strategies effectively. Then the next step is you do, I watch. And this is where they are probably not released to work on it individually, but they're working in small groups or in pairs to make sure that together they can walk through that process and use that strategy effectively. And then we release the strategy for them to use independently. Those components make a purposeful approach to literacy. That's an important component of our framework. And then the final piece of this really is what we get started with, but it leads into the next part of the conversation. That is a clear learning objective. We want to make sure that we're planning instruction that meets the standards at the depth of knowledge or the thinking level that is expected as part of that standard of that learning objective. We want to make sure that the strategy supports students at those levels as well. So we'll talk about that as we do the debrief on our content literacy overview. But this is difficult. A lot of times we design objectives that are either too low or too high, and we don't support the students in the ability to manage that process. So that's something we want to think about as we move forward. So this is where I'm going to let you do your first pause. So stop, go back to your double entry organizer, see if there's any of the prompts that you want to answer, and what are the connections you're making. Great, we're back for part 2 of the video, and now we're thinking about the learning framework matrix. So in this first column, you're going to see the learning sequence components. Activate the lesson, access prior knowledge, whatever language you use. How do we support students in accessing the information that we're grappling with today? Then how do we apply or process the information to help make those connections for the students? And then last, but certainly not least, how do we close the lesson? How do we help the students synthesize what they've learned today, situate it in context of the learning they've already had, or make connections to the things that they will be using this process or this content for later. That's an important component and often gets lost because the lesson just goes and we get to the end of the lesson. But we want to be very intentional about making sure that we design for the opportunity for students to synthesize their learning. I won't read you through all of the components of this. You have this document in front of you, but let's talk about the next 3 columns. And you'll notice the next one is what's the purpose? What's the purpose for my thinking before I get to choosing a strategy? It's important again thinking about the fact that this is not literacy for literacy's sake. It's literacy that supports my students in being successful in learning the content that I'm teaching them. And so we always want to keep that in mind first, and then we choose a strategy that helps us achieve that goal. This is not an exhaustive list of strategies. This is just some strategies to get you thinking, to get the process started. You also have strategies that are already in your building if you've done some collaborative work already. It may be at the team level or at the content level where you have strategies that are being used across multiple classrooms. The power of these strategies is that idea that if we all use strategies, the students can generalize those strategies across multiple classrooms. I may use a See, Think, Wonder in a social studies classroom, an ELA classroom, and a math classroom. So that process won't be new to the students, but how they apply it will be slightly different. So I need to make sure they understand how to apply it in my classroom. But that process that they already understand can be generalized across multiple classrooms. That gives them common language, that gives them common processes, and helps them see how critical thinking translates to multiple settings. Okay, that last column is important because we go back to that idea of purposeful and balanced literacy. It's not that it's important that you get everything written down. So the interactive word wall, for instance, is a vocabulary development strategy, but it can also be a writing to learn or an academic dialogue strategy. If I'm having students Use the language that we are studying in a quick write to end the day. And I've coupled vocabulary development along with writing to learn. But the reason we want to keep track of it is it helps us think about, did we get a balanced approach to literacy today? If I don't see any academic dialogue up there, then I'm not really activating the students' full brain power. And I want to think about that moving forward. I want to make sure that I'm giving my students the opportunity to read, write, and speak and listen every classroom, every day. Let's tell you what, let's take our second break. Again, go back to your double entry organizer. What's something that jumped out at you as you were listening to this video that you want to make a connection to, or that you want to make sure you're tracking? So we have the last component of the video to check now. And that is taking this framework and applying it to the content literacy overview module. I'm not going to read you through the matrix. You can do that yourself. But I do want to take the moment to talk about a couple of things. One, we want to think about what was our learning objective and goal, and that is to develop that common understanding of content literacy and the how and why it supports effective learning in classrooms. So with that in mind, that's how we design the work. Access what you already know, get you started thinking about that, dive you into the guidebook, give you a structure to interact with the guidebook. We used a pretty simple one, margin notes and text codes, but that's a strategy that generalizes very easily. I'm thinking about what text codes you use and helping students understand what kinds of notes to take in the margin. Doing some of that think aloud with them is a way of supporting them using that strategy more effectively. I think it's important that we talk about that third piece, and that is that processing the information. We had you read and then go back in after you read to identify 5 key or essential terms from that reading. Rather than have you go in and do it while you're reading, where you're probably then less focused on the vocabulary, we had you read it and then go back in and think about what were the essential terms that were part of that. That gave you a different way of reading, so you had to really go back in the second time and do a little bit of rereading, but you were reading for a different purpose there. Confirming what you already knew, but also looking for those key terms. And then we use something called a list, group, and label to help you organize your thinking and categorize those terms. We knew what we wanted to accomplish, and that strategy was a good way of getting you to think about what were the big overarching themes in that reading. But I do think it's important to recognize, as we talk about process all the time, we didn't scaffold that working with you because we knew we had advanced learners, experienced learners that we were working with, and that we could get by with that. If I were using that strategy in my classroom, especially working with freshmen or working with 7th graders, I would be much more intentional about scaffolding that work in there. The first time we do it, we might do it with terminology that we're very comfortable with, so they don't have to worry about the content. They can focus on the process. As we progress, I might give them some of the groups that I want them to think about, but then also might go back in and have them do it a second time, making up their own groups. So they've done it once, now they're familiar with that terminology and that process. Now they're going to go back in and do it with another variable that they can control. But it's very important to recognize that, again, we knew you all were experienced learners. Then let's talk about that last piece, and that is that closure synthesis. Again, I think it's very important that we get the students thinking about and trying to organize their thinking as much as we can so they can wrap their understanding around what they already know, think about where their learning is going. But it also gives us an opportunity at that formative feedback. You'll notice that we would normally couple this quick write with an academic dialogue strategy here, have you think about it, write down your initial thinking, but then partner up or work in small groups to share your thoughts so you could add to or change some of your thinking. I think this is a great strategy for me. I like this one because as you come back and you revisit your quick write, I can see the things that you mark out or the things that you add that you thought were important that your peers shared with you. And the reason that's important here is because if you think about where this module is situated, it's the beginning of a long training. I'm not worried about whether or not you have the right answer now. I'm worried about whether or not we're developing a common understanding. And by incorporating that peer version, that peer component, that academic dialogue, that allows me to make sure that you are taking advantage of that common language and creating common understandings. Early in the process, that's a great time to do that. I'm less worried about that individual accountability. So that's a quick overview of the thinking that went into content literacy. I encourage you to read through some of the other ones to think about and look at what we were thinking as we designed that module.